So I'm excited to connect with you. You've done a number of commentaries based on some of the videos, the interviews that I've done in the past, and our paths are finally crossing now. I want to dive into your story and who you are and what you're doing, because you're doing some incredible work through social media, through music. But let's kind of go back to your childhood. Actually, I want to go back to you coming to this country as a child. Take us through a little bit of sort of your early years. What was it that brought you and your family here to America?
So I'm ethnically Armenian. My father is full Armenian. My mother is adopted by an Armenian family in Azerbaijan, Baku. So that's the city we come from, is Baku, right in the Middle East off the Caspian Sea. And that region of the world hasn't always been good to Armenians. If people are familiar with the Armenian Genocide of 1915 by the Turks, there's always been tension there in that part of the world. And so as the Soviet Union was starting to go through things in the 80s and things are becoming tumultuous, and all kinds of different miscommunications happening of how Arzis are being treated in Armenia. Azerbaijanians then have this pogroms of Baku in the late 80s. And so my father, my grandfather, pretty much all the men had to get out of there as quickly as possible. And they, at one point, borrowed police uniforms from their friends to just dress up and just try to get on the train and get out of there as quickly as possible. It was a very, very crazy time. And me and my mother actually ended up staying behind because, again, my mother's adopted. So she's ethnically Ukrainian or Russian. That's what my 23andMe said. But culturally, she's Armenian. So we ended up staying behind to kind of settle all the affairs while my dad had moved on to Moscow. And pretty much a lot of the Armenians have gotten out of Baku. And that is where we kind of saw some pretty gnarly stuff of people coming to our soldiers coming to our house, people coming to our house, getting reports that we were Armenian, and my mom saying, "Hey, no, we're not Armenian, we're Russian," and to the point where our physical health was in danger at some point. And so, thankfully, by the grace of God, we were able to get out of Baku. We stayed in Moscow for a little bit, and then my family and I finally immigrated to the United States in 1991, May of 1991, as refugees. I was about 6 years old at the time.
Wow. When you reflect on that and you look at obviously what's happening right now in this country, there's lots of different things happening politically and socially, but kind of pulling back from that, in light of being a refugee and watching your life and your trajectory and where you are now, how has that sort of impacted your appreciation of or view of America itself?
Oh my goodness. We applied for refugee status in Israel, in Australia, and America was the last place that we applied for refugee status. So my life could have went so many different directions had we not came to America. I remember coming to America and we went by a Lucky's grocery store off of El Cajon and the 805 freeway in San Diego. That was like one of the first places we went. And I remember looking at the store and seeing all the colors and the lights and how beautiful it looked. And I thought, oh, this is so sweet. My parents took me to the toy store the moment we landed. Like, this is so awesome. And it was the grocery store. Like, that's how different America was in contrast to what we had experienced in under Soviet Baku, lining up for food rations. I remember we would have a tub of water that we'd have to share amongst
Wow.
my family, my dad, my mom, and my grandparents. But we lived with my grandparents for a while. So very, 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 very different. And so I've grown substantially more appreciative of America, though there's issues here, but man, it is a very stark contrast in terms of what the Soviet Union was like.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine that. It's a question I like to ask people when they've come here, and especially having the memories of what you went through. And then, knowing that you can in your house just turn on the shower whenever you want to. You can go to, an actual toy store if you want, or to the grocery store. I mean, we have so much that we take for granted. But one of the things in your story that's interesting too is the spiritual aspect of it. After you come to America, the lack of belief at some point that develops for you, the atheism that develops for you at a really young age. Talk a little bit about what sort of formed that initial rejection of faith.
So in Baku, we never went to church. I don't remember anything about church. Matter of fact, the only thing I remember about God was my grandfather saying something about God. And the word God, bulk, kind of sounded similar to the word corner for some reason to me as a kid. And so I was like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Like, why are you talking about this part of the room? I was very confused. And then when we came to America, the community aspect was the Armenian Orthodox Church. This is a part of the Oriental stream of Christianity. And that was kind of where we gathered. That was our community hub, if you will. And so you have a lot of refugees that came out that didn't really go to church back in Baku. And now we're kind of a part of this church. And I ended up getting christened in the church, becoming a altar boy in the church. And so I have to show you some pictures. I'll send you a picture when we're done of me next to my terchayat as a child. And I ended up being an altar boy, which was fun. It gave me something to do. And being an altar boy, you have certain responsibilities. And then like the older kids, I'd say like kids who are teenagers, maybe 13 to 15, they have other responsibilities. So they can light the incense and do certain things. And I couldn't do other things. Anyway, to make a long story short, there was a group of boys that were older, 13, 14, 15-ish, and they were in my neighborhood in the same area. So now at this point, we were the first Armenian family that came out, but now at this point, there's probably, I don't know, 100 families that have came out to San Diego. And so long story short, these older teenagers, and I'm about probably 7 or 8 at this point, ended up showing me same-sex porn and then reenacting the things that they saw in the videos on me when I was a child. And that really, really jacked me up. But what jacked me up even more was the way the church responded or didn't respond. It was kind of brushed under the rug. No one really wanted to talk about it. There was no real
Wow.
accountability for them. And they, being older and more articulate and more persuasive, kind of turned it and made me look like the aggressor, which was crazy because I'm like 5 or 6 years
I was
younger
going to
than
say you're a
them.
small kid
I'm
at
a
that
child.
point.
Yeah, I'm literally like probably a foot smaller than these kids. And they kind of flipped it and made me look like the bad guy, which really did a number on me. At the same time, my mom and dad split, and my mother is going into just a downward spiral of alcoholism, just dating really toxic men. My dad brings out his girlfriend from Baku. They had cheated on each other up until that point multiple times, and he ends up bringing out his girlfriend, and the church remarries them. And then from a mom's perspective,
Wow.
she felt like, well, technically we're still married on paper. There was no divorce that happened in America. According to my dad, they had separated back in Baku. I don't know the particulars on who's right and who's wrong, but that really did a number on her to see the church remarry them. So then she becomes hardened. I have this situation happen. My mom is telling me that the church is wrong for doing this. And so I became very, very hardened to the idea of God, to the point where I'm 9, probably like 10, 11, 12 years old. I'm full on an atheist. There is no God. And if there is a God, he does not love me. That led me down a spiral of getting arrested at the age of 11 for breaking into homes, attempting to be in a gang. Gangster rap is at its peak in this part of the 90s, like the mid 90s at this point. And I was really a troubled preteen at that point, smoking weed, selling weed, breaking into homes, just a complete
Wow.
derelict of a kid.
Well, you also have that trauma of coming from, like, you're a refugee. You've gone through the memories you even mentioned, right? Of having to share tubs of water, of these, horrific things that people shouldn't even have to deal with. You had to deal with that. You've moved, and then these traumatic events, the abuse there, and then the issues with your parents. That's a lot to take on. And it's crazy. I have an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I think about the way their brains work, right?
Mhm.
To be 10 years old and to say there is no God, right? That's a really kind of crazy thing to think about because of the way kids' minds work, right? So, but you had seen a lot, you had gone through a lot, and thank God that is not the end of your journey. We're sitting here now. You go through from there a period of, a couple years later, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but starting to sort of dig into this faith issue, reading some books, Case for Christ, and another one that really shaped you. Talk a little bit about that journey from the arrests and the chaos into actually believing.
So in the midst of all this arrest, I end up having to do community service hours. It wasn't a lot. It was, I don't know, 50 hours of community service. And I had my apartment complex had a lady named Cherie. Cherie was our manager, but she was also involved in some street activities. At one point, so me and her son were like best friends. He's like my first American friend. Her house ends up getting shot up, like drive-by happens to the back of our alleyway. She was just involved in some crazy things. And thankfully, Steven, her son, was at my house when the drive-by happened, and because they literally shot up where his room was. So we'd do like sleepovers. And Cherie ends up going to jail for I believe moving cocaine through an airport, and she ends up doing a couple
Wow.
years in jail. And in jail, she ends up getting radically radically converted. While she gets radically converted, she leads like most of our apartment complex to start going to church with her. It was like a typical Black Baptist church. They weren't Pentecostal or charismatic, but it was in that stream of Christianity. And so when I get arrested, I have to do my community service hours. I end up having to do them with Cherie and my next door neighbors, Charlie and Willie. And they kind of became like father figures for me. And they started sharing the gospel with me. And they would tell me things like, you're going to do great things for God someday. And I was like, there's no way. Long story short, I finished the community service hours. We moved to North County, which is where I live today. So that's the San Diego, Normal Heights, City Heights, North Park area. Now I'm in Vista, California. And the seeds just keep being planted. God just kept sending people in my life in very unorthodox ways of people that weren't living right, but their parents would take them to church. And I would just kind of started getting glimpses of the gospel. And it all culminated to the end of my freshman year. I win this talent show at Bringo Terrace Park. I do a performance, a rap performance. Two of my buddies kind of performed with me. I had been dabbling in hip hop for since an early age because I was so into Snoop and Dre, Tupac. And I met a girl and she was very into me at the time. And this is the end of my freshman year of high school. So the only way to see her was to go to church because now the school is done, right? It's summertime, was to go to church with her and her family in the summertime on Sunday. So the only way I can see her in the summer, I have to go to church with them on Sunday. So I start going to this church just as a means to see her and hang out with her and unfortunately fornicate and be sexually immoral. And in that, I start hearing the gospel. I start hearing about this Jesus. And that led on to a 2-year wrestle of me breaking up with her and getting back together and dating a Jehovah's Witness girl and having Muslim friends. This around the same time as 9/11, Mormon, like all the angles you could think of. And God again sends people to me. And at my manager at Pizza Hut, my first job, and our lead delivery driver were Christians. And they give me this book called The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which was a book by Josh McDowell. They've since updated with him and his son, Sean McDowell, which me and Dr. Sean McDowell are friendly now, which is crazy to kind of all full circle. And I end up reading a lot of that book, and it just gave me all the answers. And I was convinced that Jesus isn't just the Son of God. Jesus isn't just a prophet. Like Jesus is who he says he is. And that this is after about a year and a half of wrestling. I end up, me and the Jehovah's Witness girl break up. I tell her she's in a cult. I was real nasty to her. And fast forward, I end up fully surrendering my life to Jesus at the end of my junior year of high school. About a month after that, where I just break down, I fully give it all. I get into a small group. About a month after that, I end up making a public profession of faith at Miles McPherson's, he called it the Miles Ahead Crusade. So think of kind of like what the Billy Graham Crusades were, but it was Pastor Miles here who used to play for the Chargers. Me and Miles are friends now, which is a trip. So I give a public profession. I get plugged into a church. At this point, I've been going to church, but I mean, I'm really serving, engaged, and God
You're
sent
in it
me.
at that point.
Yeah, and God starts sending mentors around me. Some guys that did music as well, and they also love Jesus. They did hip hop, named Future Shock. They mentored me. I'm still friendly with them. They do a lot of stuff in television now, and God just kind of preserved me in that whole process, those couple years of wrestling, and I finally landed at like a solid faith in that Jesus is who he says he is, and it kind of came through the door of apologetics. So yeah.
Wow. It's incredible because as I listen to that story, and it's so common sense, but I think we often forget like how many people in that path God used to reach you, right? From the woman at the apartment complex all the way down the line. And that to me, it makes me wonder, we have to think, are we allowing ourselves to be used in the way that God wants to use us? Obviously, he can use us however he wants, but are we taking those steps? Because all of those people in your path, the delivery driver, I mean, you had so many people that connected the dots and made that puzzle come together for you that landed you where you are. And the cool part about your story is you flash forward even more. And obviously through music and then through YouTube and the videos you do, you're tackling all sorts of really tough, really interesting issues. You're sitting down with great people and just breaking it all down for people. What was it for you that kind of took you from, okay, now you've got that deep faith, but now you're going to dive into media in the way that you have and use it the way you have to reach people? What motivated that?
So I was already dabbling in YouTube from about 2015 to 2020. I didn't share my faith a whole lot because I didn't want to be a Christian YouTuber, if you will, right? I just kind of wanted to talk about my music stuff and some daily vlogging, and people can still go dig up all those videos. I didn't take those. Those are still up. But what really was interesting to me is during the pandemic, people started asking my opinion on other things. They knew that I was a Christian, and so I was doing kind of like music reviews. I had seen some success as an independent musician, and people just started asking my opinions on other things. And I would lead Bible studies, men's Bible studies for decades. We would come together Monday, or I would do a Bible study with an open mic on Thursdays. So I was always leading Bible studies. I was always kind of using this gift of teaching. And what would happen is a lot of times people would come in from whatever was happening in their week or whatever was going on in the news or whatever situation was trending, and they would ask questions about it. And so we kind of segue from said topic of whatever was happening in society, and then we'd go into the Bible, right? This is, I mean, even though the way I came to faith, it was like around 9/11, I'm starting to go to church, and it's like, well, why did that happen? Well, why are these things happening? And so people would take me from, hey, this event happened, and this is what the scriptures say about these sorts of things, right? And so I basically took that same format, if you will, of like leading Bible studies and translated it to YouTube. And so we would talk about some of my first videos that gone viral was talking about Nick Cannon not wanting to be monogamous and how asinine that whole thought process was on his part. We would talk about things like the Bethel prophets and some of the outlandish statements they made. And so it was just kind of looking at what people were asking my opinion on, giving my opinion on it. And slowly over time, it's morphed and evolved. And it was really putting the viewer first. What does the viewer care about? What's on their heart? What's on their mind? And how can I try and gently drive it back to scripture? So from one standpoint, it was kind of evangelistic because people were coming in to hear about whatever issues happening in the zeitgeist. And another topic, it was like, hey, there's a degree of commentary and discussion that's happening. And that opened the doors for me to interview guys like Pastor Greg Laurie and Tyrese and all kinds of folks from all types of different walks of life. And we kind of do a hybrid of that now, part reaction stuff, commentary on whatever's happening day to day, and then also just podcasting and having interesting conversations with interesting people.
Yeah, it's a fun space to be in because in a lot of ways that's the space I've been in different ways. And so watching you do it, I think the way that you do it is incredibly engaging. And like you were saying, really figuring out what do people want to talk about, what matters right now, and what is sort of the faith angle on that, because everything has a faith angle. And I got to ask you this because it's interesting, your trajectory, your journey. You know, I was in high school. I was a senior in high school when 9/11 happened. And for me, when I look at the stats and the numbers and you look at American culture, a lot of the denigration and sort of the chaos, it really started when you look at those numbers to happen around 2000, 2001,
Yeah.
you know, and if you look at the Gallup trends, it's crazy. Just we've sort of fallen apart on morals and values. Your journey though of coming to faith, you were coming into your faith and getting stronger as the moral values were denigrating. And I don't know, what do you make of that? What has that been like for you to have a growing faith and have a strong faith and to be ministering to people at a time when the culture is devolving?
Well, I think what you're describing and getting at is perhaps the culture devolved because the faith that we had as Americans wasn't really a faith anchored in Jesus. There's a book that came out, I can't remember the title of it, but it talks about moralistic therapeutic deism, where that is our view. God's kind of like a therapist. He's kind of like a genie in the sky. It's not super engaged. He's more of a deistic God. And so I don't know if the decay happened because of a shift in our faith versus just an honesty about what most Americans believe, whether they're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, agnostic. They kind of all believe the same core tenets of this moralistic therapeutic deism. And so for me, I knew that wasn't it. I knew that God wanted to be personal with me. I knew that God cared how I lived. He didn't want me to have sex with my girlfriend. He didn't want me to then go get an abortion if I had sex with my girlfriend. Like there were certain things that God had an opinion on, and it was about how I was conducting my life. And it was in my best interest. So when Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, following God and God's ways in God's kingdom and living his way, seeking his kingdom is not just to make my God happy for whatever arbitrary standards. No. It's actually in the way he designed for me to live. And I don't know, for some reason, all of that just clicked for me. And I was not perfect. I had to go to therapy. I had to deal with all this stuff from my childhood. But slowly, my life just became more aligned with as well. I'm not saying I didn't have trouble. I'm not saying I didn't suffer. I didn't saying I have issues, but things just started to align. So it was almost the confidence and the faith grew the more I obeyed Jesus. And the more I obeyed Jesus, the more I saw the fruit of the Spirit in my life and the impact God was having through my life and serving people. And so it all just kind of clicked for some reason.
No, I love that. And I think too, you know, this is a whole other, we should actually do a separate conversation on this, because one of the other things that happened during that time frame was that media exploded, right? We all have phones in our hands that like we're so inundated with content all the time. That wasn't happening before the year 2000. That's a relatively, so if you have a week, faith, if you have a cultural Christianity, let's say, going on, when you start mixing in that information and that influx, it's going to knock down those walls pretty quickly, and change perspectives. And so I think we've seen a lot of that happen as a result. But final question for you in this conversation, when you look at the work you're doing now and how you're reaching people, at the end of the day, what is your inevitable goal? What do you want the final sort of impact to be as a result of it?
I think what I'm trying to do with everything we're talking about is to encourage, empower, and inspire people to live a life that blesses God. When we see in scriptures Simeon have an encounter with baby Jesus in Luke chapter 2, it says he blesses God. And that phrase just means to praise God with our lifestyle, right? So Romans talks about this is our reasonable sacrifice to offer up our bodies. And so what I'm trying to do and what we're hoping to do is to tie in all these conversations to get people to see that living God's ways is actually the best way for them to be in God's will. And that comes from applying God's word. That's what we're driving people towards. And that may look like a live event. That may look like our prayer journal, getting people to pray more consistently. That may look like a long form podcast. I'm writing a book right now. And so that's what we're trying to drive people is how can we get people to live a life that blesses God instead of just seeking for the blessings of God without doing the obedience aspect. And it's good for us. God's ways are good for us. They're not oppressive. They're not suppressing us. They're actually in our best interest. And we get to be more effective to continue that ministry of reconciliation that Paul talks about in Second Corinthians.
Well, listen, I love it. I'm looking forward to connecting with you again. Lots of important conversations to have. Appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you so much, Billy.